Good evening, and thank you to a very special event that we're having here on campus. I'd like to just take a minute and thank my colleagues in the history department, in particular our student assistant, Victoria Hupp, who did some really nice work for us on this. Also the members of the Special Events Committee and all of the technological wizards who do lights and sound and all of the things that I as a historian do not do. I'm Dr. Hilton. I teach in the Department of History, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to two people on our stage. The first, all the way over on the right, is Dr. Renate Neeman, who is a new faculty member here in the Computer Science Department. And it is because she came to my office one day and knew that I taught a course on the Holocaust that we actually have this amazing opportunity here tonight. She said, "My mom's a Holocaust survivor. Do you think you'd like to have her come and speak?" And I didn't answer immediately because I didn't want to scare her with my enthusiasm, but I said a definite yes. And also, of course, her mom, Dr. Renate Neeman. She's going to be talking to you tonight about her experiences growing up in Germany in the late 20s and into the 30s, and then the experiences that her family underwent when they had to depart Germany to try to find safety in the Netherlands in 1938. She'll talk for a little while, then she'll give me some sort of signal. We're going to figure out what that is. And then there will be an opportunity for people from the audience to ask her some questions. So without further ado, the doctor's needed.
I'll ask you a question. So, hello, you. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like for your family when the Nazis came to power in Germany?
Well, in the beginning, can you hear me? Does this work? All right. I was a first grader when the Nazis came to power in 1933. I was in first grade, and one fine day I came home from school 2 months after Hitler came to power, and there was a brown shirt, which is a Nazi, standing in front of our front door and would not let anybody in. Why? My father had his law offices on the main floor of that building, and we were living on the second and third floor. Well, they had pasted a poster over his shingle. The shingle said, Dr. Edward Berg, lawyer and attorney at law. And the poster said, Jewish law perverter. And nobody was permitted in. Well, I went in, but that was a child. But that was about the end of my experiences for the time being. It was much harder for my sister, my half-sister, who just graduated from high school and was going to go to university to become a partner in her father's law firm. Well, this was 1933. Hitler had achieved power, and no Jewish students were permitted in the university any longer. So what to do? My parents looked around and were able to send her to Edinburgh to university, and instead of studying law, she studied languages, that is English, and business administration. She stayed there for 1.5 years, then came back and went for a year to France, to the Sorbonne in Paris, with the same kind of program to learn French, to learn also Spanish, and to learn business administration in French. Then she came back home again after a year and worked in her father's office as a secretary, as a manager, office manager, and applied to come to the United States, and she got a visa, and by 1937, in summer, she emigrated to the United States. Life was good for her. We could not leave. By that time, Jews already had to hand in their passports, so they couldn't leave the country, and all kinds of other restrictions were put upon them. And among other things, they had to pay an escape tax. That is, if they went and left Germany without permission of the police and the Gestapo, they would be incarcerated, sent away to a concentration camp, whatever. Well, so my parents and I couldn't leave. I was by that time in high school. In Germany, the elementary school was only 4 years, and then came high school. And I was in a convent school of the Ursulines. They had opened their doors to Jewish students, and they were absolutely wonderful, taking care of me. That is, letting me do everything that everybody else did. But I didn't have to participate in their religious exercises. Well, in May 1938, my father got a phone call from a friend at the police department. He had friends at the police department and the government to notify him, or to tell him that by Monday morning, this was a Saturday, the Gestapo would come and pick him up from his office. That meant being sent to a concentration camp in Germany. My father was not a well man. He had kidney trouble and was otherwise health-wise not so very well off. So he didn't think he could survive a concentration camp and felt he had to flee. No passport, no money out of the country. How was he going to do it? Well, we had a lot of relatives all over, not only in Germany, but in the Netherlands and in other countries, in France and so on. So he decided that he was going to visit with family near the Dutch border, who lived in Germany, but near the Dutch border, and they might help him find somebody who would get him across the border. They went there on Saturday and night, and by Sunday, they had gotten together with a passeur, that is somebody who took people illegally across the border into the Netherlands. The passeur was willing to instruct him how to do it, but was not willing to take him. That was too dangerous for him. So he got informed in information how to go about it, and my mother still had her passport. But they came in '37, I believe, to take everybody's passports away. My father had so many friends in the law enforcement and so on, that he talked with them and said, look, she isn't leaving without me. Let her keep her passport. It doesn't make any difference. She isn't going to leave without me, and I have none. So my mother took the train to Amsterdam. My father went, as instructed, to the border near Enschede, which is on the Dutch side. there was a highway that was the borderline, and the highway was, there was police going up and down every 10 minutes, so people shouldn't cross the border. So he waited at the edge of the highway. The police came by on a motorcycle, two agents, passed around the bend, and he went across the road and jumped into the Netherlands. It was a farmhouse there. The farmer and his wife were sitting, it was a Sunday afternoon, in back of their house. They saw him jump. They clapped their hands and thought it was a wonderful way of coming in, and invited him in to join them for tea. And my father asked whether he could use the phone, called his brother in Amsterdam, and the brother sent a car, and he was picked up and went to Amsterdam, where my mother had arrived by train, and everything was very nice. But they couldn't take me along. It was too dangerous. So the Dutch were going to accept them to live in the Netherlands as refugees if nobody would follow them. And they said, well, we have a 12-year-old child. And they said, okay, she can come, but nobody else. Which meant my grandmother, who was taking care of me at home, could not come. And I went to Rhine near the Dutch border on the German side, and the Dutch cousin came by car and picked me up and took me to the Netherlands, and then I was free, just like my parents. Well, we lived in Amsterdam, and how did we live? We got help from our family in Amsterdam, and we had an apartment where we sublet several rooms, and some people got their meals with us, and so we managed to live very nicely. I went to school, but going to school, I didn't know Dutch. And that was very difficult because I didn't understand a word, so they put me 2 grades back, and that was not easy. But after a while, I caught up, and within 6 weeks, I felt I could catch up also with the regular program. But it was a public school, and the principal said, no, you can't go ahead just because you now know the language. So I was put into a different school, a private school with a scholarship, and they let me do 2 years in 1 year. It was a wonderful school, and that was in '39. And in 1940, in the spring, the Germans overran the Netherlands. And that was the end of that school. That school closed, and I had to go back to public school. And I was put right back into the year that I'd lost, the 2 years that I'd lost before. And that was not easy. But after a year, the Germans kicked all Jewish children out of the public and private schools that were not Jewish in Amsterdam. By that time, all the German decrees about Jewish were not allowed this, that, and the other were also implemented in the Netherlands, just as harshly as in Germany. So there was a little group of people who had come from all the various schools, but particularly from the Montessori Lyceum. The Montessori system is different from the regular public school system. It's a wonderful system anyway. I got a scholarship in that group also, and I was permitted to do 2 years again in 1 year, and finished it. But that was the end of education. By that time, I was, what, 14? No more school. And the Jews were no longer permitted to go into any entertainment, use the buses, use the public transportation, use anything, not even the stores, unless they were specifically designated as opening for Jewish people to purchase their groceries and things that they needed for daily life. And the owner, by that time, we got a visit from the police, the German police in Amsterdam, to pick up my parents because they had not paid in person their escape tax in Germany, and were therefore they had to take 3 months incarceration. Well, they were in Holland, they weren't in Germany, so all that didn't matter. But now the Germans were in full force again, and so they picked up my father. They wanted to pick up my mother at the same time, but they managed to convince them that one of them had to stay home to take care of me. And so they only took my father, and he went to Germany to jail. And we didn't know whether we would ever see him again. But in spite of the fact that the transports had started to the camps in Poland, my father came back in November of '42 under police escort, and they were going to take my mother to jail in Germany at that time. Well, my mother was in hospital, so they couldn't take her. And my parents decided that we had to go into hiding. And with the help of our relatives, we came in contact with people who helped Jews to go into hiding. One fine day, a young man arrived, said his name was Pete, and he was going to see whether he could help us. And then he sent a young woman whose name was Mia, or she said it was Mia, and she said she had a place for me. Not in Amsterdam, where we were living, but in the middle of the country called Amersfoort, a town, very nice town. And she took me away. I didn't know where my parents were going. They didn't know where I was going, and they were not permitted to know where I was going or I know where they were going, because if one of us got caught, even under torture, we couldn't tell where the others were. My parents found, finally, after quite a number of changes, a support place in a student fraternity home in Amsterdam. I think you have seen some pictures of it here. I was first with a family, with a woman with 5 children, a widow, and then after a few months I was moved on to a young couple, the photo of which you have seen, who had one child of their own, one Jewish child, and I joined them, and I was becoming the helper with the household, with the children. And then a few months later, their second child was born in the room next to me in that house. And they were a wonderful young couple. He was a civil engineer, she was a housewife, and they opened their house to a number of people who came for a day, a week, a month, several months, in addition to the two that were there. And throughout the war, they helped many people to survive. Not only survive, my parents didn't have to pay for me. They gave me a monthly allowance so that I could buy little things for myself that I needed, and some things for my parents. And they gave me food to send to my parents, because every once in a while, one of the people who took care of placing Jews in hiding came to bring meal and take meal back. But the connection between this home and that home was via a number of couriers, so that the first one didn't know where the mail went, and the last one didn't know where the answer went. I lived with them for 2.5 years. Not only was I part of the family, I had violin lessons. Like the husband had violin lessons, so his teacher taught me too. I was hiding in plain sight. It was unusual, and it was quite wonderful. And I'm still in contact with the lady of the house, who is 96. The others have died. But everybody who was in that household in hiding survived, whether it was temporary or whether they went to other places. My parents were in Amsterdam, in a fraternity house of Amsterdam University, and were taken care of by 4 young people. They didn't know that these young people, 2 sets of brother and sister, were cousins, and their aunt. But they looked after them, not only that they had food and shelter, but they brought books from the library. They held sessions, of talking about this subject, that subject. They had festivities. It was unbelievable. And my mother was the only one in that household who was Jewish, who was in charge of answering the door, of going and doing the shopping for this place, for doing shopping for other hiding places for people, because she looked exactly like a Dutch farm woman, blonde, blue-eyed, even though she couldn't speak Dutch perfectly. And that's how we survived. We made it through the war. We were liberated after the end of World War II. And 2 weeks later, we got together again, even though we hadn't known where each one lived. And a year after that, we came to the States. Any questions? Want to know?
I expect there'll be hands going up. Mary Beth?
Yes.
Did you just happen to run into your parents? Like, how did you actually reconnect?
I'm sorry.
How did you reconnect with your parents? How did you?
It was actually not so difficult. The young people who took care of us saw to it that I was able to come to Amsterdam and meet my mother in the streets every 8 weeks or so. So we saw each other, and then we went, my mother and I, to one of my former elementary school teachers where I was staying most of the time for a weekend. And that's, I figured, because she liked to stay at a stand at a particular bridge in the center of town to admire the place, that my parents must be within sight of that particular bridge. And so my father could see me through the closed curtains. That's what I figured. And 12 days after the war ended, I got a ride with a Canadian army truck to Amsterdam and went to the bridge, crossed the bridge, and rang the bell at the first house. And it happened to be the right house. But I also must tell you that my grandmother, who had taken care of me, perished in the Theresian stuck camp, and 3 brothers and 3 sisters, 3 widowed sisters of my father's, 3 brothers with their wives, perished in a number of different camps. We don't know which ones. Somewhere between 41 and 43.
When you got to the States, how long did it take you, or did you meet back up with your half sister?
I'm sorry?
When you got back to the States, when you were able to go to the States, did you see your half sister?
Immediately. That was another adventure. I came on a children's transport via France, and the children were between 17 and 20, almost 21. I was almost 21. If I hadn't come when I did, I would have had to wait for years to get a visa. Being underage, quote unquote, I was a minor who could come with her parents. And my parents could come to go to their daughter. So that was my lucky break. I got here, I was in a hurry to get here because I wanted to get an education, and the semester at the university started in September. So I was in a hurry. And I went with this children's transport. We went to Paris, and from Paris to Marseille. And in Marseille, we went on a troop shift, a French troop shift. That was an old World War I gift of the Germans to France. And the Germans had used it in the Far East as a trade ship with passengers. And the French had used it the same way until World War II. And then in World War II, the French fleet was sent to the United States. And the boat was transformed into a troop ship and worked during the war. And after the war, it hadn't been re-transformed transferred into a trader. So here we were, a group of some 30 children, 7 from the Netherlands, got together with a group in Paris, went to Marseille, went on the boat. We were in that boat, in the box, in the ship. There was a part that was for passengers, regular, and we went across the Atlantic, but the boat wasn't very well working anymore. We were stuck in the middle of the Atlantic for a while, but the weather was all right. So we got all the way to the United States, to New York Harbor, and there we were stuck. We were out of fuel, out of food, out of everything, and the harbor personnel was on strike. And there we were with all our good intentions. Well, after that, the police came and dropped off some food in barges, and the children of the children's transport were taken off the ship 2 days later. And on the dock, my sister and her new husband were waiting for me. My parents came in November, direct from the Netherlands. Yes?
Marty.
So when you came to the States, you got your degrees in therapy and also psychology. Why those two things?
Well, it was a long trip. I came in '46 and started at Hunter College, which was a city college of New York, because I had a green card as a permanent resident of the city, so I could compete for a place. And I was going to study chemistry. So what to do? And there was a very nice service to find out what you were interested in, what you were able to do, what you could succeed in. And they tested me and said occupational therapy or something similar. And I tried out in various hospitals and liked it and signed up. And that was, Hunter College didn't have that education, so I went to New York University and got a scholarship and got the degree and started working. And then 10 years later, I got a master's in education to help educate within the occupational therapy program. And by the time I was almost a grandmother, I did the psychology degree.
Please, Beth.
While you were still in Germany, before you were able to flee, how much did you understand as a small child what was going on up to the point that Hitler assumed power, etc.?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Up to the point that Hitler came to power was not part of my life. I was still in kindergarten. I was a little toddler, a young child. Didn't matter. And by the time I was in elementary school, it wasn't that terrible yet. Kids had friends and kids were playing, and they came to our house and I came to their house, and that was fine. But after 4 years, the elementary school was finished and high school was a different story. I was lucky I was in the convent school. They were very wonderful. Yes?
Please speak.
How did you feel about living basically in hiding, just being in public? Like, were there any close calls?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I was stopped by the Green Police. I was stopped by the Gestapo at various points. And that last winter was another adventure. We were living at the edge of town, and then there were some farms, and behind those was woods. Our rations, food and otherwise, were minimal. We had no fuel, no electricity, no gas. We had no wood. We had 800 calories for adults per day, with no proteins. It was very bad. So we went into the woods to steal, but the woods were also a hiding place for the German Air Force. So they always had platoons watching and going through the woods, so nobody would cut wood, so they would not be visible, or whatever they were hiding in the woods was not visible from above. And in that January, we went. There was a young lady also in hiding with us at the time. She was a pianist. And she was a very lively Dutch girl. We went into the woods to try and steal branches, because we had 2 babies and a little girl in the house. They had to be fed. We also had to be fed. And you can't live on tulips bulbs for like very long. That was our main vegetable. Potatoes, yes, if we could get some. It was pretty impossible. So we went, the 2 of us, the 2 girls, with a sled into the woods, and the first time we brought some branches home, and they were cut up, and we were cooking in cans. You know, empty cans. They were made into little ovens, and we put potatoes in water on the can and lit it. And it took 8 hours for the water to boil. And then, you know, by evening meal, the potatoes or whatever was cooking in the can was ready to eat. But at the third time that we went into the woods, we got caught. And they were going to take us to wherever it was, that they were taking people who were in defiance. And this girl started to joke with them and tell them stories. And they were so charmed by her that they helped us with getting wood. They stood watch while we were cutting wood. And then they escorted us to the edge of the woods so we could get home safely. And that was started in January of '45. The guy who was in charge of the platoon was sent to the Eastern Front by March. But he made sure that he imprinted on his troops that they should take care of us. And they did until liberation. Yeah.
When you were in hiding, you and your parents, did your sister back in the United States know anything about how you were all doing during the war?
Well, a little bit. We had relatives in Switzerland. So every once in a while, a letter through couriers went out of the country to a cousin in Switzerland, and she communicated with my sister to let her know that she had heard from us. But she didn't know what was going on with us. They didn't know we were in hiding. They just knew that every once in a while they got news.
Please.
In January of '45, did you realize that the war was close to being over?
Yeah.
And also, who were the first Allied troops that came through the area that you were in?
The Canadians.
Canadians.
Yeah. You see, the large American part didn't cross the Rhine. They went south of the Rhine, east into Germany. And they went in September of '44. We had to wait till the end of the war. Yes?
Was there another hand?
Yes?
Was there any close calls for your parents that you were working on?
I'm sorry?
Close calls for your parents when they were in hiding in Amsterdam?
Yes. Now, they were 10 people in that place, and very often more than 10. And my mother was the only one who opened the door. Whenever there was somebody coming to the door, ringing the bell, the other 9 people or more had to disappear into a certain hiding place they had in the building. And once they were secure in that hiding place, and it was a hiding place under the roof over the kitchen, but the kitchen was not at the back of the building, it was sideways. So whoever saw the building from the rear or from the side thought it was part of the next house. So they never checked that particular part. And so everybody survived in that house. And everybody who had been in that house survived.
Mr. Newman.
Were you able to notice a difference in the attitude of the occupying, the Germans, towards the end of the war? Did they?
They were scared. But that was it.
I'm assuming that these were regular German troops and not SS.
But they were under the boot of the SS and the Gestapo and whatever, you name it. Yes?
Of the general population, did you notice more people willing to help or not?
It's very hard to tell. When we came to Holland, there were 140,000 Jews all over the country. But the main groups were in The Hague and in Amsterdam in particular. Of those, some perhaps 20,000 managed to get out of the Netherlands away before the war. Of the rest, actually some 25,000 went into hiding, but many were caught. So altogether, 105,000 Jews were sent to the concentration camps and extermination camps. How many do you think came back? all of 5,000. Everybody else perished. Yes.
My great-grandmother is a Dutch Jew, and her family was able to escape. She and her parents, but none of her relatives were, and none of them came back.
Yeah. It was apparently that particular number within the Dutch population was the largest group in any country in Europe other than Poland.
How difficult was it living under the Nuremberg laws, especially after?
Under the what?
The Nuremberg laws, the restrictions and whatnot.
Miserable. I mean, the Nuremberg laws was the beginning. And after that, it got more and more and more severe.
Morning.
You mentioned that some of the people who were helping you, you hadn't realized were relatives. I was a little bit confused. They were cousins of someone?
No, we knew them. They were relatives. Half of them were Dutch citizens. The other half hadn't made it yet, or they were refugees. But we had a large number of Dutch citizen cousins. My father had 3 brothers who lived in Holland.
Diane,
Yeah.
how did this affect your faith? Were you practicing your faith at all while you were not in Germany, or while you were in exile, or when you came to the United States? Did you continue to practice your faith as a family?
Yeah, but I mean, as a family, yes. But of course, while in hiding, no. But for instance, we lived with this young family, and at one point they took in a Jewish rabbi and his family of 5. And the woman got her kitchen changed to have a kosher kitchen for them. They were unbelievable. And he worked for the underground on the side. And I went back to visit them with my elder daughter and her 2 children in 2010. They had 9 children.
Karen.
Can you talk about what motivates you, or what has motivated you to translate documents and to share your story as you have with us tonight?
An accident. I was messing around in my basement in 2000, and there was a box of my mother's papers. And I opened it, and it was a fragment of her memoirs that she had written for a cousin in Africa after the war, that is in 47. And she kept a carbon copy of what she had typed, but not all of it survived. So here I was reading the story of what she had experienced, they had experienced, that I had known. And I told my children that I had found it, and they asked me to translate it. They wanted to know, of course. So I finished the book, the fragments that were missing, and translated it, and that's how it came to be. And I sent the German, a copy of the German part to a cousin in Germany. And and she showed it to a friend of hers who was a publisher. And they asked for permission to publish it. And they published it first in German and 7 years later in English. Yes?
So what's the name of the book?
Memoirs of Life Underground, 1943 to 1945. And the author is Erna Berg, E-R-N-A-B-E-R-G.
So are you going to be mentioned in this book?
Yes, because I translated it. Besides my stories in it too. Yes.
Did you ever ask the Dutch families, or your parents asked the Dutch families, why they helped you, why they took a risk in hiding?
They were just, that was their belief system. That it was their duty to help people in need. They were Dutch Reform. They were religious, but not, you know, very expressive that way. Of course they had Christmas and Easter and all that, but they didn't go very much to church. But this was their life. This was how they lived. And the young people who got us into hiding lived in Amsterdam. The young man who was in charge of my parents became a professor of history at Leiden University. And he was president of that fraternity house as a student. And he got his sister and his parents and his cousins and his aunt into this. And that was strictly on their belief. You could not allow this kind of horror. They were unbelievable people. They were wonderful. And they put their lives on the line, not only for us, but their entire families. If they had been caught and they were in difficulty and in very dangerous situations ever and again during that period, they would have been killed. But they wouldn't let go. Yes?
In all of this, was there any particular moment where you felt most scared for your life and the lives of your loved ones?
Well, there were several, but there was one in the first hiding place was a family of 5 children, was a widow. They had a raid. That is, the Green Police and the Gestapo locked a neighborhood, locked it up, and went from one house to the next and searched each house top to bottom for illegal radios, for too much food, for illegal residents, you name it. And in the street where we were, they went again from house to house. And usually it took them 20 minutes, half an hour. 3 people came into the house and searched. They came into this house. There were these 5 children. 2 of them were already graduated from high school. One was in the upper grade, and the other two were younger. And the lady of the house had guests. So there were 9 people and me. That's a lot of people in a small house. And they came in, and I was in the kitchen, and I had very poor papers, false papers. They were very poorly made, and I didn't dare show them to anyone. And, well, they opened all the cabinets, they looked in the beds, under the beds, you name it. They found radio parts. The middle son was doing electrics in high school. He was learning electronics, whatever it was, and they were building radios. And he had to prepare some of that at home. And there were the parts, and that was illegal. And then they really got mad. They stayed, and then there were so many people there. 2 of them weren't registered to live in that house. And so everybody had to go into the living room. They didn't see me. I was in the kitchen. I was peeling potatoes. And I peeled potatoes for 4 hours. They were in that house, and they hadn't been in the kitchen yet. And then they came into the kitchen. And so the two of them were emptying the cupboards and found too much food and you name it. And there I was peeling potatoes. And the third one looked at me and said to the other 2, "Look at her, she looks so Jewish. Ask her for her papers." What was I going to do? I was there, in plain sight. I didn't react. I peeled potatoes. So he nudged one of them. "Come on, get at her." And I looked up like retarded and said, "What's that doing here?" Well, that wasn't very helpful. Somebody retarded? You can't talk with them. Let it go. That was the end of it.
Did you ever go back and visit the places that you were living in, like at any point in your life?
Yes. In 58, 59, I went for a year and a half to Europe to study for a year at the University of Geneva. But I had a Volkswagen bug. So I could travel, and I had vacations, and during vacations I went all over. I visited family in Italy, in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and I went to congresses and what have you in between. So I visited. I visited the family in Holland. But in Germany, I did visit and stayed with a cousin, but I sat in her kitchen in my hometown and shivered. The only place that I really visited at that time was my high school, and that was the convent, and there was the little sister who was watching the entrance and got everybody in and out, and she recognized me, and she was lovely, and I was allowed to go and see various classrooms. But I was uncomfortable in Germany, in my hometown. And then I stayed for several weeks in the Netherlands with family and visited the people who had helped us and all that kind of thing, yes. And then in 2010, I went with my elder daughter and 2 granddaughters and visited again. And at that time, I went to my high school and told my story as I've told you.
Zach, I'm going to give you the last question.
While you were in hiding, how aware were you of what was going on in the government and on the German war front?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch what you said.
While you were in hiding, how aware were you with what was going on the war front and in the government with everything else?
Well, we read the newspapers, whatever they sent us, and we had a radio in the hiding place. And so we heard what's going on in the world. And we were ready to be liberated in September of '44 when the Allied forces came north through France. And we were hoping, you know, in a few days to be free. No such luck. We were free on May 5th, 1945.
Will you join me in thanking the doctor?
It was a pleasure and an honor to speak with him.